around 767 of our Common Era. But that book that was written by Ibn Ishaq has not survived in its original form. It survives in a recension done by a certain Ibn Hisham some 60 years later, a half a century later. So sometimes that seerah work, that biography, is referred to as the biography of Ibn Ishaq, and sometimes the biography of Ibn Hisham, sometimes named after its author, and sometimes just simply called after its editor, whose recension we now have. So it does come a little bit late, and when one reads the biography, then one has to adjust for a certain amount of tendentious shaping. The idea being that as people remember the original stories, that memory itself becomes tainted by events that occur over time, certain new influences that arise as people live on. So one has to, in reading the seerah, make some adjustment and try to understand what was the original story before it came to be told in this particular way. Muslim scholars were aware of this kind of tendentious shaping, so they painstakingly tried to analyze each individual report about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Now, for those who are familiar with studies on the Christian scriptures, we have in the Gospels an apparently connected narrative. If we think of Mark's Gospel, for example, you will find that Mark continues to say, immediately Jesus did this, and then immediately he did this other thing. And what scholars realize is that Mark adapted some 83 pericope, or pericopes, or episodes, and he linked them with some linking phraseology, such as immediately. Whereas, in fact, they're individual, disconnected reports about something Jesus said on an occasion, or something that he did, mostly what he did, because Mark includes very little of the sayings of Jesus as compared with Matthew and Luke. But they're individual, small reports, snippets, about something Jesus did or on a certain occasion, without the occasion being so firmly a part of the report itself. And now it was Mark's task to string them together into a continuous whole to make a story from beginning to end. So a similar thing has happened with the biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace. By the time the biographies are written, there was a need to give us this connected story, and the biographers were working with the small snippets. So what Muslim scholars have done is that they have identified these small snippets and called each one a hadith by itself, and they've analyzed the sources of these ahadith or hadiths to find out where does it come from. If you're saying it now and you live 100 years after the Prophet Muhammad, well, who told you? You must have got it from some source, and we must try to identify the reliability of those sources. Much the same as today, if you're citing someone else's work, you have to put a footnote or an endnote identifying the source from which you derive the information. Otherwise, you might ask, why should we trust the information that you're relaying? So in a similar sense, the early Muslim scholars worked at this to identify the sources of each report, and such works produced as a result of that are found in what are called today hadith collections. So we have seerah works, biographies of the Prophet, and then which are connected stories, and then we have hadith collections, which are collections of the snippets as they are without connecting them into form a whole story. Because in trying to connect them, you will have to paste together or connect together episodes which are authentic with pasting material or connecting links which themselves may not be authentic. So better to leave the snippets as they are, and that's how the hadith collectors work with things. So now we have a situation where to understand the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, you can go to these two sources. If you want more authentic information, then you go to the hadith sources, and the hadith works. And if you want a connected story, knowing that the information may not be so absolutely accurate, you go to the biographical works where you get the full connected story. Now, it is in the biographical works that we have much information about the early years of the Prophet Muhammad, about his birth and incidents surrounding that. We are told that the Prophet Muhammad was born of his parents, Abdullah and Amina. And Abdullah died while Amina was still pregnant, yet to deliver Muhammad. Muhammad's mother, Amina, also died when he was only 6 years old. And he was then left in the care of his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. And his grandfather soon died too, I believe within a couple of years. And then he was transferred into the care of his uncle Abu Talib, who Muslims will know to be the father of Ali, another famous person in the history of Islam. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had a very humble beginning, a very pitiable childhood. But it seems that in the history of Islamic thought, this has some significance, that the Prophet grows up in this humble circumstance so that he can learn to depend on God, who will commission him and with whom he will have a very close relationship. To make a long story short, he eventually grows up. He finds his people to be worshipping idols. There are a few people in the area who are thought to be Hanafa, or people who are on the primordial religion, accepting monotheism and not sharing in the idol worship of the times. And the Prophet Muhammad obviously was one of them. When he was about 25 years old, he was in the employ of a rich woman in Mecca, Khadija by name, and he traded on her behalf. His trading took him to Syria on occasion. So he may have heard some religious discussions on these business trips, but that would be his extent of knowledge of Christianity and Judaism prior to his receiving the revelation in the form of the Quran. So he marries Khadija eventually when he's 25 years old, and the tradition has it that she was by this time 50 years old. Her age might have been exaggerated a little bit, and this is what happens. We talked about the tendentious shaping. Some Orientalist scholars suggest that she might have been something more about 38 or 40 years old. And this cannot be certain, but one has to adjust for people exaggerating things. She was old. How old? Let me tell you how old she was. So the age tends to be pushed upward, and one has to make some adjustment that way. He did not marry any other woman while she was alive, and it would be 10 years into his mission when she eventually dies. But let me take some time to get to there. When he is about 40 years old, which means 15 years into his marriage, he begins to be attracted to solitude so that he can meditate and contemplate the divine mysteries, the wonders of the world, and the purpose of human life. It is on one such occasion when he was contemplating in a cave known as the Cave of Hira in Mecca that he received an extraordinary visitation. The angel Gabriel, whom we know from the Gospel according to Luke, who once spoke to Mary, now comes to speak to him and says to him, Iqra, which means read. And he says, Ma ana biqari, I am not a reader, or what am I to read? And this is done again, and a third time, until the angel begins to tell him what to read. Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. Read in the name of your Lord who creates. خلق الإنسان من علق, creates man from a thing that clings. اقرأ وربك الأكرم, read, and your Lord is most noble. الذي علم بالقلم, who teaches by the pen. علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم, he teaches man that which he did not previously know. So these revealed words given to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, now forms the opening 5 verses of chapter 96 of the Quran. And that gives you some idea that the Quran is not arranged sequentially according to the way in which the revelation came to the Prophet Muhammad. The first revelation is now the beginning of the 96th chapter rather than the first chapter. Over a period of 23 years, the angel will keep coming back to the Prophet Muhammad, delivering such pieces to him and instructing him what he is to read. And his recitations then become public. His followers would memorize those recitations and also write them down on whatever pieces of writing materials could be found, until eventually, within 2 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, all of those pieces of writings will be compiled together, compared with the memories of those who had taken the trouble to memorize these passages, and a fully and complete written collection would be made and left in the care of Abu Bakr, who was the first successor after the Prophet Muhammad. But I've gone ahead a little bit again. So the Prophet Muhammad then is married to Khadija, and he begins to receive these extraordinary revelations. And now he begins to preach them in Mecca. And